can a freshman congresswoman fell one of America's most powerful Supreme Court justices with a single question. The Supreme Court chamber holds its breath. Harsh overhead lights skate across Samuel Alito's stern face as he leans in, fingers laced, locking eyes with Jasmine Crockett. Congresswoman Crockett. His voice slices through the air, heavy with condescension. You claim expertise in the Constitution, yet your argument runs against decades of precedent. Perhaps you're confusing a political agenda with the law. A murmur ripples. This is no routine inquiry. It's a direct hit at the competence and credibility of a 42-year-old congresswoman, a rising former civil rights attorney. The camera pushes in, a brief twitch at Crockett's jaw, then calm. To those who've watched her, quick-minded, unflinching under conservative hot seats, the look is familiar, not fear, calculation. From the conservative benches comes an anticipatory buzz, as if a takedown is imminent. But in that short silence, Crockett has spotted the trap and is already setting the counter. The tension stretches taut as drumskin. Judicial independence now sits beside hard questions of ethics. Constitutional authority collides head-on with the public's demand for transparency. At the eye of the storm are two people, two creeds, a famously unyielding justice and a not-yet-two-term lawmaker who's no stranger to impossible fights. If you want more stories like this, where knowledge and composure stare down absolute power, hit subscribe and join our community at Jasmine Crockett File. We bring you political moments that don't just shock, they inspire. Justice Samuel Alito was no ordinary Supreme Court justice. Appointed by President George W. Bush in 2006, he had spent nearly 2 decades cementing his reputation as one of the court's most steadfast conservative voices. At 73, his thin silver hair framed a face known for its unchanging, serious expression. His clerks called him the stone judge behind closed doors, not just for his unwavering conservative positions, but for his methodical, relentless questioning style that had dismantled many unprepared lawyers. Before joining the Supreme Court, Alito served as a federal prosecutor and a judge on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. He prided himself on his strict textualist approach to the Constitution and his ability to dissect arguments with surgical precision. In recent years, Alito had grown increasingly vocal in his criticism of what he called progressive overreach, writing scathing opinions that made headlines for their unapologetic conservatism. Today's congressional oversight hearing on judicial ethics clearly irritated him from the start. He viewed it as a direct assault on the court's independence, an institution he believed should remain above political scrutiny. The suggestion that Supreme Court justices needed external ethics enforcement was to him both insulting and dangerous. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, representing Texas's 30th congressional district. At 42, she was relatively new to Congress, but no stranger to high-stakes legal battles. Before entering politics, Crockett had built a reputation as one of Texas's most effective civil rights attorneys, winning cases others deemed hopeless. Her legal acumen was matched by her no-nonsense communication style, which resonated with voters tired of political doublespeak. With her natural hair styled in twists and wearing a bold red blazer, a color her staff knew signaled she was ready for battle. Crockett brought both expertise and personal experience to the hearing. She had faced hostile judges throughout her career, particularly when representing black defendants in conservative districts, and had honed her ability to turn impossible courtroom situations to her advantage through meticulous preparation and a knack for spotting logical inconsistencies. The stakes of this confrontation extended far beyond personal reputations. This hearing came amid growing public concern about the Supreme Court's legitimacy. revelations about undisclosed gifts to certain justices, controversial public statements, and unprecedented leaks had damaged the court's standing. Public trust in the institution had plummeted to a historic low of 34%, according to the latest Gallup poll. For Alito, this hearing threatened not only his reputation, but the court's traditional independence from congressional oversight. If Crockett succeeded, it could lead to the first-ever binding ethics code for Supreme Court justices enforced by external review. For Crockett, this was a chance to restore accountability to an institution that increasingly appeared to operate above the law. Success could cement her rising status in democratic politics, while delivering a victory for government transparency. Failure could entrench the court's immunity from oversight. The hearing room buzzed with journalists, legal experts, and political operatives. Cable news carried the proceedings, live with commentators speculating about the tense exchange between the justice and the Congresswoman. On social media, the number Crockett trended nationwide within minutes of the opening statements. What no one realized yet was that this confrontation was about to take a turn that would shock the legal and political establishment. With all due respect, Justice Alito, Crockett began, her voice steady and measured. I'm not here to debate my credentials. I'm here to ask why the American people should trust a court that refuses the basic ethical standards applied to every other federal judge in this country. Alito's jaw tightened. The Supreme Court has its own internal ethical guidelines. Congresswoman, he replied. Perhaps you should review them before suggesting we operate without constraints. I've reviewed them thoroughly. Justice Alito, Crockett shot back, opening a folder of highlighted documents. That's precisely the problem. Those guidelines have no enforcement mechanism and have repeatedly failed to prevent conflicts of interest that would disqualify any other federal judge. The room tensed as Crockett alluded to recent controversies. Luxury trips funded by billionaires with cases before the court, spouses involved in issues tied to court decisions, paid speaking engagements at politically charged events. Though she named no names, everyone knew which justices she meant. Alito shifted in his seat, his frustration visible. Congresswoman, the Constitution established the court as a co-equal branch of government. This hearing seems designed to undermine that independence under the guise of ethics reform. He countered, his voice taking a professorial tone. Crockett remained unruffled. The Constitution also established checks and balances. Justice Alito, no branch operates without accountability to the others. That's not a modern interpretation. That's Federalist Paper 51. Madison's own words. A murmur ran through the audience. Crockett was meeting Alito on his preferred terrain of constitutional originalism. Sensing an opening, Alito leaned forward. Since you mentioned Madison, Congresswoman, perhaps you can point to where in the Constitution Congress is granted authority to impose ethics rules on the Supreme Court. His lips curled slightly, confident he'd found his moment. Article 3, Section 2. Crockett responded without hesitation, which explicitly grants Congress the power to make regulations and exceptions regarding the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. Further strengthened by Article 1, Section 8, the Necessary and Proper Clause. Alito's expression flickered briefly. She was more prepared than he'd anticipated. A creative interpretation. Congresswoman Alito said, but for over 230 years, those clauses have never been understood to grant Congress the power you're claiming. Never. Crockett raised an eyebrow, pulling another document from her folder. Then how do you explain the Judicial Conduct and Disability Act of 1980, which established ethical standards for federal judges, or the Ethics Reform Act of 1989, which limited gifts and outside income for judges? Congress has regulated judicial ethics repeatedly. Alito's face reddened slightly. "Those acts deliberately excluded the Supreme Court," he began. But Crockett interjected. "Because of political compromise at the time, not constitutional barriers. Nothing in the Constitution exempts Supreme Court justices from ethical standards applied to other federal judges." Alito shifted tactics. "Congresswoman Crockett, you speak of ethics with such certainty. Yet during your campaign, didn't you face questions about campaign finance irregularities? Perhaps you should focus on the ethics of the legislative branch before lecturing the judiciary." The attack was personal and unexpected. A ripple of reaction spread through the chamber. Gasps of surprise, nods of approval from Alito's allies. Crockett staffers exchanged worried glances. This was a prepared attack, suggesting Alito or his team had researched her background for vulnerabilities. The camera zoomed in on Crockett's face, networks hoping to capture a moment of shock or anger. Instead, she smiled. A small, composed smile that puzzled observers. Those who knew her recognized it as the expression she wore in courtrooms just before unveiling game-changing evidence. "I'm glad you brought up my background. Justice Alito," she said, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction because it gives me the opportunity to address something directly relevant to these proceedings. She opened another folder containing email printouts and financial records. "The campaign finance question you referenced was fully investigated and dismissed. My campaign was exonerated completely. But since you've opened this door," Crockett continued, "I'm curious about your attendance at a private fundraising retreat in 2022, where you reportedly met with donors who had interests in cases pending before the court." Alito's face froze. "I don't know what you're referring to, Congresswoman," he said. "Let me refresh your memory." "Justice Alito," Crockett replied, sliding a document into view. "The Eagle Forum retreat at Hammer Ranch in Texas. According to these records, you attended as a featured speaker while the organization had filed an amicus brief in a case pending before you." Cameras caught Alito's hand tightening around his pen. "That was a simple speaking engagement. Not a fundraiser," Alito said, his voice cooler. "I have the invitation right here," Crockett countered, holding up a printed email. "It explicitly describes the event as a donor appreciation weekend, with ticket prices starting at $1.00. The language is quite clear. Before Alito could respond, she pressed on. "But what's particularly interesting isn't just your attendance, Justice Alito. It's that you never disclosed this potential conflict. Nor did you recuse yourself from the case where Eagle Forum submitted an amicus brief. In fact, your opinion cited their brief favorably." The chamber fell silent. Network producers scrambled, instructing reporters to verify Crockett's claims. "This appears to be a clear violation of Canon 2 of the Code of Conduct for Federal Judges," Crockett continued, "which states judges should avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety in all activities. The very code you implied doesn't apply to you." Alito's attempted ambush had backfired spectacularly. What began as a justice disciplining a congresswoman had transformed into accountability being demanded from one of the nation's most powerful judges. The committee chairman, sensing the explosive moment, announced a 15-minute recess. As attendees buzzed with speculation, television commentators declared this one of the most dramatic confrontations between Congress and the court in modern history. What no one realized was that Crockett was just getting started. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere had shifted. News of Crockett's revelation about Alito's undisclosed speaking engagement spread like wildfire across social media and news outlets. Reporters confirmed details from the invitation and unearthed photographs showing Alito mingling with conservative donors. Alito returned looking visibly tense, his usual composed demeanor replaced by a rigid posture. His team had clearly used the recess to prepare a defense. "Before we continue," Alito began, "I want to address the misleading characterization of my attendance at the Eagle Forum event. I received no personal compensation, and my participation was no different from many justices who speak to legal organizations across the ideological spectrum." Crockett listened patiently, allowing him to finish. "Thank you for that clarification, Justice Alito," she said. "However, the issue isn't whether you were personally paid, but whether you disclosed your participation in a fundraising event for an organization with business before the court. Disclosure requirements exist to ensure public confidence that justice isn't influenced by special access." She then displayed another document on the hearing room's large screen, a list of Alito's undisclosed appearances between 2018 and 2023, at least 15 events absent from his official disclosure forms. "Congresswoman, this is becoming a fishing expedition rather than a good-faith discussion of judicial ethics," Alito protested, color rising in his face. "On the contrary, Justice Alito," Crockett replied, her voice measured and professional. "This is precisely what a good-faith discussion of judicial ethics looks like. Transparency, accountability, equal application of standards." Turning to the committee, she continued, "What we're seeing exemplifies why the Supreme Court cannot continue to police itself. When confronted with clear ethical lapses, the response is denial and deflection rather than acknowledgement and correction." Addressing Alito directly, she asked, "Justice Alito, earlier you challenged my credentials and suggested I was motivated by a political agenda. Let me ask you directly. Do you believe Supreme Court justices should be exempt from the ethical standards that apply to every other federal judge in America?" It was a perfectly crafted question, offering no easy answer. If Alito said yes, he'd appear to claim special privilege. If he said no, he'd undermine his own position. After a pause, he tried to find middle ground. The Supreme Court faces unique considerations that other courts do not. Our ethical frameworks should reflect those differences. That wasn't my question. Justice Alito, Crockett pressed. Should you be exempt from the same ethical standards as other federal judges, a yes or no would suffice. The chamber was silent, all eyes on Alito. No, but he began. "Thank you," Crockett interjected. "Now, given that answer, how do you justify not disclosing these speaking engagements when Canon 4 of the Code of Conduct for Federal Judges explicitly requires disclosure of compensation and reimbursement for extrajudicial activities?" Alito fell back on a technicality. "Those requirements don't formally apply to the Supreme Court," he said. "So you do believe you should be exempt?" Crockett noted, catching the contradiction. She pressed further. "Let me be specific. The Ethics in Government Act requires all federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, to file financial disclosure reports, including gifts aggregating more than minimal value. Private flights to speaking engagements, luxury accommodations, and security details provided by private organizations qualify as reportable gifts. Do they not?" Alito shifted uncomfortably. "That interpretation is— I'm not asking for an interpretation. Justice Alito." Crockett interrupted her prosecutorial experience evident. "I'm asking for your understanding of a law that applies to you as a federal official." Before Alito could respond, Crockett displayed a private jet manifest showing his transportation to an undisclosed event provided by a corporation with cases before the court. This flight alone, valued at approximately $3,000, is well above the reporting threshold, she stated. Yet it appears nowhere on your financial disclosure forms. Gasps echoed through the chamber. This was no longer about speaking engagements. It was about potentially illegal failures to disclose valuable gifts. Justice Alito, are you testifying under oath that you boarded a private jet without knowing who provided it? Crockett asked, her tone conveying skepticism. Murmurs spread through the audience. Even if we set aside legal requirements, she continued. Do you believe the American people deserve to know when justices accept expensive gifts from parties with interest before the court? Alito tried to reframe the conversation. The American people deserve a court that decides cases based on the law, not political pressure, he said. That's precisely why disclosure matters, Crockett countered. Without transparency, the public has no way to know whether decisions are based on law or influenced by undisclosed gifts. She paused, then delivered her most devastating point. In 2017, you wrote in a dissenting opinion, and I quote, "Transparency is the cornerstone of governmental legitimacy." Do you still believe that? Or does it only apply to institutions other than the Supreme Court? The silence was deafening. Alito had been caught in his own words. Transparency applies to all government institutions, he finally acknowledged, but must be balanced against other constitutional considerations. I agree completely, Crockett said, nodding. Which is why our proposed ethics legislation includes mechanisms to protect judicial independence while requiring the same ethical standards as other federal judges. Would you like to hear those provisions, or would you prefer to continue claiming this is an attack on the court without understanding what we're proposing? The dynamic had reversed. Alito, who began by questioning Crockett's understanding, now found himself on the defensive. I'm familiar with the proposed legislation, Alito replied stiffly. Then you're aware it preserves the court's judicial independence while requiring the same ethical standards as other federal judges. Crockett pressed. When Alito didn't respond, she addressed the committee and cameras. The Supreme Court's legitimacy doesn't come from its marble columns or historic precedents. It comes from public trust. When justices accept undisclosed gifts, hide speaking engagements, and claim they're beyond accountability, the trust erodes. Turning back to Alito, she delivered her closing argument with the precision of a seasoned trial lawyer. Justice Alito, you questioned my credentials and suggested I was motivated by a political agenda. But the documents presented today tell a different story. They show a pattern of behavior you would find unacceptable in any other federal judge. The question isn't whether Congress has the authority to establish ethical standards for the Supreme Court. The question is whether the court has the integrity to acknowledge it needs them. The committee chairman thanked both Crockett and Alito, but the damage was done. What began as Alito's attempt to discredit a congresswoman had become Crockett's masterful exposition of the ethical problems necessitating congressional action. As the hearing adjourned, reporters rushed out, filing stories about Crockett's remarkable turnabout and the damaging revelations about Alito's undisclosed activities. Legal experts on television panels discussed whether the evidence might warrant a formal investigation beyond the ethics reform debate. For Jasmine Crockett, the confrontation was a defining moment in her political career. For Samuel Alito, it's an unprecedented public reckoning that threatened his legacy and the court's resistance to external ethics enforcement. Within hours, Crockett exposes Alito trended nationally. Video clips of the exchange amassed millions of views across social media. Headlines declared, "Justice served Crockett exposes Alito's undisclosed luxury travel and Supreme showdown. Congresswoman corners justice on ethics violations." Confirmation of Crockett's claims came quickly. Flight records matched her manifest. Photographs from the undisclosed events showed Alito in attendance. The Eagle Forum's newsletter detailed the exclusive donor retreat featuring Alito as their honored guest. In the White House briefing room, The press secretary faced questions about the administration's stance on Supreme Court ethics reform. "The president believes in the independence of the judiciary," she said, carefully, "but also in the importance of transparency and ethical standards across all branches. He's following these developments closely." Conservative media initially framed the hearing as an attack on the court, but as evidence mounted, they shifted to damage control, even if these events weren't properly disclosed. One Fox News commentator argued that doesn't mean the justice's legal reasoning was affected. Liberal outlets were less restrained. What we witnessed was the exposure of a double standard that has allowed Supreme Court justices to operate with less accountability than any other government officials. An MSNBC analyst said Crockett didn't just win an argument. She demonstrated why reform is necessary. On Capitol Hill, the political calculus shifted rapidly. Moderate Republicans who had opposed judicial ethics legislation now reconsidered their positions. One senior GOP senator told reporters off the record, "After what we saw today, voting against basic disclosure requirements will be a tough sale back home." Democratic leadership seized the moment. The Speaker of the House announced that the ethics bill would receive a floor vote within 2 weeks. Today's hearing removed any doubt about the necessity of this legislation, she declared. When a justice cannot explain why they failed to disclose valuable gifts, reform isn't just appropriate, it's essential. Legal experts weighed in. What made Crockett's approach effective, a former federal judge said on CNN, was that she didn't attack Alito's judicial philosophy. She focused on specific documentable ethical lapses that would be unacceptable for any other judge. A constitutional law professor wrote in the Washington Post, "Crockett exposed the contradiction in the court's position. Justices cannot claim to be trusted to self-police their ethics while failing to meet basic disclosure requirements." For Crockett, the aftermath was transformative. Her office was flooded with interview requests, and Democratic strategists identified her as a rising star. Small dollar donations poured into her campaign from supporters nationwide. In a statement outside her office, Crockett remained focused. "Today wasn't about me or Justice Alito," she said. "It was about a principle that transcends partisanship. No one in our democracy is above accountability. I hope this moves us closer to restoring trust in our institutions." At the Supreme Court, an emergency meeting of the justices was reportedly called, according to the New York Times. The court considered adopting a formal binding code of ethics before Congress could impose one. The Chief Justice released a statement. "The court takes its ethical obligations seriously and continuously evaluates its practices. We are reviewing the matters raised at today's hearing and will address them appropriately." For Alito, the consequences were severe. Legal ethics experts called for his recusal from cases involving organizations tied to his undisclosed activities. A judicial watchdog group filed a formal complaint with the Judicial Conference of the United States. His reputation as a principled conservative was undermined by his failure to follow clear disclosure requirements. Editorial boards that once praised him now questioned his judgment. 3 days after the hearing, polling showed public support for Supreme Court ethics. Reform had jumped from 65% to 78%, with Republican voter support rising from 42% to 61%. The confrontation sparked broader discussions about the court's accountability structures. In the weeks that followed, law reviews and constitutional seminars began teaching the Crockett-Alito exchange as a live case study in separation of powers and ethical governance. 2 weeks later, the Supreme Court announced it would adopt a binding code of ethics, mandatory disclosures, and an independent review process included, a significant concession to public pressure. Asked for her reaction, Jasmine Crockett simply smiled. "Sometimes change doesn't come from force of law," she said. but from making the alternative untenable. The code wasn't perfect, but it was a meaningful step toward rebuilding public trust. On Capitol Hill, the Congressional Ethics Bill advanced in a revised form, centering transparency over enforcement mechanics, a compromise that let both parties claim a measure of victory. For Crockett, the win was unmistakable. What began as an attempt by a powerful justice to diminish her ended by elevating her as a principled champion of accountability. One commentator put it plainly: in a single hearing, she achieved what years of advocacy hadn't, making Supreme Court accountability a bipartisan conversation grounded in disclosure and equal rules. The Crockett-Alito moment will live on in law schools and political science programs as a study in oversight, judicial ethics, and effective communication. A reminder that preparation, evidence, and strategic clarity can bend even the most entrenched power. It offered a rare moment of clarity. Accountability is possible when pursued with determination and principle. Share your take in the comments. I genuinely want to hear from you. If this resonated, like, share, subscribe, and tap the bell for more stories. Check out the featured video on screen. It's a piece we're especially proud of. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you next time.